She shrieked like I'd just stolen the crown jewels, demanding I unlock her community gate, unaware the key she needed was mine, by law and by labor. "I'm calling the police!" she screamed, fists balled like thunderclouds. "Lady," I thought, "you're shouting at the man who designed the lock you're locked out of. And it's about time someone locked Karen out of everyone else's life." It started on an early spring morning, the kind that makes you want to sip coffee on your porch and appreciate the quiet before the neighborhood starts humming. But that peace shattered the moment I heard the first banshee wail of the season. HOA Karen had returned from her winter hibernation. And as the self-declared president of a homeowners association she had no legal authority to run, she had once again found a new petty crusade to lead. This time, the locking of the community gate that marked the entrance to our private road, which, as fate would have it, I had installed myself as a licensed locksmith and resident of our neighborhood for over 15 years, and which had been left unsecured for months at the HOA board's inconsistent whim until a string of thefts forced me and several neighbors to finally take initiative and secure it properly. But of course Karen wasn't consulted, and anything done without her imperial blessing was apparently treason. So now here she was, storming up to my driveway in her yoga pants and fake Gucci sunglasses, shrieking about how I had no right to lock the gate, that she had a yoga class to get to and couldn't be trapped like an animal, all while ignoring the fact that she had bypassed every proper chain of communication and had been warned multiple times that the gate would begin operating on scheduled key access starting that very morning. So I calmly stood, coffee in hand, explaining the situation, even showing her the notices we posted and the emails sent. But she refused to listen. Instead, pulling out her phone and threatening legal action, declaring that she was going to report me to the real HOA. Not realizing the documents she clung to like gospel had expired 2 years ago, and the current legal stewardship of the road was in the hands of a voluntary resident committee, of which I was chair, and the gate itself, installed after the HOA, dissolved, was commissioned and funded by homeowners, including myself, meaning she had about as much authority over that gate as she did over the moon. And when I gently mentioned all this, she turned purple with fury and launched into a personal attack, calling me a grease monkey, mocking my profession, and shouting to all within earshot that I was illegally tampering with community infrastructure, which made me laugh. So hard I nearly spilled my drink, because not only did I install the system and hold the certification for it, I also had the legal maintenance contract and the master override credentials, which I knew would soon become relevant when Karen, in her tantrum, stormed back to her SUV, peeled out in reverse, and went straight to the gate, where she predictably failed to enter the correct code, screamed at the keypad, pounded on it with her fists, then got out and attempted to tailgate another resident in, only for the motion sensors to detect unauthorized entry and lock the system down completely, trapping her temporarily between the exit bollards and the incoming barrier, and it was in that moment, her trapped in her own tantrum, that she marched back up the hill, red-faced and wheezing, and demanded I open the gate immediately or face consequences, to which I responded with a polite but firm smile and said, "Karen, you don't have authority here, and the gate doesn't answer to entitlement," at which point she absolutely lost it, calling the cops, who arrived with weary expressions already familiar with Karen's antics, listened to both sides, reviewed the documents I provided, including municipal confirmation of the gate's legality and management transfer, and ended up advising her to calm down and maybe talk to the resident committee instead of trying to command it, which only made her more furious as she stormed off muttering about lawsuits, harassment, and conspiracies, while the rest of us finally exhaled and began to feel the first winds of change, because this wasn't just another Karen moment. This was the moment she realized the community had woken up, taken control, and locked out the chaos she thrived on. And little did she know, this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel every inch of her imagined authority, expose her abuses, and force her to face consequences she thought only others were subject to. Because when you go to war with a locksmith, You'd better know which doors you're trying to open and which ones are about to close on you forever. The Monday after her gate meltdown, Karen doubled down like only a suburban tyrant can, printing out crumpled, typo-riddled flyers that she jammed into every mailbox on the block, illegal, by the way, claiming I was violating federal access laws and had illegally detained her on community property, which was hilariously ironic considering it was her own refusal to learn the code or acknowledge posted updates that locked her in the first place. And when I pulled one of her wild-eyed manifestos from my own box, it was complete with bold red, lettering words like investigation, abuse of power, and citizens' rights, all smeared across poorly photoshopped pictures of the gate I'd designed, circled with angry arrows like a conspiracy theorist's corkboard, and I almost wanted to frame it for comedy value. But instead, I decided it was time to get serious, because this wasn't just about one nuisance neighbor anymore. Karen was actively endangering the sense of trust and peace the rest of us had worked hard to rebuild since the collapse of the original HOA 2 years ago. When it was disbanded after a massive financial scandal revealed that the old board, which Karen was conveniently never a part of officially, though she always hovered at the edges like a vulture, had misappropriated dues and failed to file necessary state documentation, essentially rendering the organization defunct and leaving us to restructure our governance through a new, optional community committee with real transparency and a rotating leadership model to prevent power hoarding. Everything Karen hated, of course, since her whole persona relied on barking orders and being the final word on nonsense like grass height or fence color. But since she couldn't get her way through actual participation, she resorted to the usual tactics: intimidation, rumor-mongering, and bureaucratic sabotage, except this time she'd made the critical error of targeting not only me, but a system I legally installed and maintained with full community support and municipal approval, meaning she had absolutely no case. So when she submitted a phony cease and desist letter typed in Comic Sans, yes, really, demanding I remove the lock system within 7 days or face full civil liability, I called an emergency community meeting under our new charter, open to all residents, and printed a copy of the letter on poster board so everyone could see just how unhinged it had become. And when Karen tried to storm the meeting and declare herself interim HOA president, despite no such position existing, she was met with collective groans and even laughter as I calmly explained the truth, backed by signed documents, legal endorsements, video footage of her behavior, and finally my Locksmith certification, bonding, and work contract. At which point she went eerily quiet, lips pressed so tight they practically vanished into her face, because even in her deranged self-image, she knew the truth was undeniable, and the audience wasn't buying what she was selling. But that didn't stop her from trying to retaliate in new, increasingly desperate ways, filing a noise complaint when I so much as sneezed in my own garage, attempting to follow me to job sites in her SUV with binoculars, accusing me of surveillance for having a Ring doorbell camera, and even trying to dig up dirt on me from county records only to discover that, to her horror, I not only had a clean history, but was something of a local hero for helping bust a break-in ring last year, thanks to a custom lock system I helped design for a nearby neighborhood, which got covered in the local paper. And if there's one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was being on the wrong side of public opinion. So, in a last-ditch effort, she filed a complaint with the city, alleging I had illegally modified public infrastructure, not knowing, or not caring, that the road and gate were clearly registered as private, and when the inspector arrived, he and I had a cordial conversation over coffee while Karen peeked from behind her curtains like a Scooby-Doo villain, only to be told in no uncertain terms that the installation was up to code and fully permitted, at which point she marched. out barefoot in her bathrobe, hair in full explosion mode, screeching about how they were all in on it and how I'd bribed the city, which led to the inspector calmly asking her to step back and suggesting she consider mediation or simply attending the next community vote like everyone else, which only sent her spiraling deeper into paranoia, and that's when things got truly twisted. Because she started trying to sabotage the gate directly, jamming it with sticks, spraying foam sealant into the key slot, and once even tying a chain to the exit arm and trying to tow it off with her SUV, which failed spectacularly, thanks to the reinforced steel and led to her bumper ripping clean off in front of 3 witnesses, one of whom recorded the entire thing and uploaded it to our community forum, where it quickly became the most viewed post in history, captioned, "Karen versus Physics, Round 1, and suddenly people who had previously stayed neutral started speaking out, sharing their own Karen horror stories. The time she accused a neighbor's child of vandalism because he was drawing chalk dinosaurs on his own driveway, or when she yelled at the mail carrier for parking too close to her trash bins, or when she wrote threatening notes to a retired veteran about his flag size being unpatriotic. And now the tide was turning fast, because nothing unites a neighborhood like a common enemy, and Karen had gone from nuisance to liability, and even the city began taking notice after repeated vandalism reports, and the police being called multiple times, leading to a warning citation filed against her for property damage and public nuisance, which sent her spiraling into full victimhood mode, crying about how she was being bullied, discriminated against, even suggesting she'd contact the media, which she did twice, only to be laughed off both times when reporters realized there was no story beyond a woman having a meltdown over a secure gate she didn't understand. And so I began preparing for the inevitable escalation, upgrading the gate system with tamper detection, off-site backups, and a new feature, a secondary camera and intercom that allowed residents to buzz in guests remotely, meaning Karen could no longer claim emergency lockouts to bypass the system without being exposed. And then came the final straw. She attempted to host her own Karen-approved HOA meeting in the community park with snacks, folding chairs, and a handwritten banner, except nobody showed up except one guy who thought it was a garage sale. And after waiting an hour in the sun, she packed up in silence and drove off. A shell of the tyrant she used to be, finally realizing that when you try to rule a kingdom without a crown and burn every bridge along the way, the only door left to you is the one no one else will open. And unfortunately for her, I held the master key. By the time summer rolled around, Karen was like a storm cloud that had thundered itself dry, still looming, still dark, but more pathetic than threatening. And yet, as anyone who's ever dealt with a long-term control freak knows, the most dangerous moment is when they realize they've lost their grip entirely. And sure enough, just as our neighborhood began to relax, basking in the relief of her public embarrassment and the peace the new gate system brought, Karen reemerged with a new plan, one that didn't involve sabotage or shouting, but infiltration, because apparently somewhere in that scorched earth mind of hers, she decided the best way to take back control was to run for an open seat on our newly formalized resident committee, and the moment I saw her name appear on the nominee list, I knew we were in for one final war, because while the role had no real legal power and mainly served as a liaison between the community and local services, it would give her a platform, a voice, and worst of all, perceived legitimacy, which Karen would exploit like a tick on a dog. So I did what any sane, peace-loving man with a long memory would do. I got ready to fight her with facts, receipts, and the truth. And more importantly, I quietly began organizing the neighborhood behind a single, qualified candidate, Michelle, a retired school principal known for her even temper, sharp mind, and zero tolerance for BS. And together, we created a subtle but powerful campaign, not flashy or confrontational, but built on promises of transparency, fairness, and communication, all the things Karen had spent years destroying. And to my great satisfaction, Nearly everyone responded with enthusiasm, especially after I quietly passed around a Karen highlight reel video compilation that one of the teenagers on our street had edited together, complete with dramatic music, freeze frames of her tantrums, and side-by-side citations from the actual bylaws she'd broken, which not only reminded people of her past antics, but exposed just how unhinged her current campaign promises were, including mandatory yard inspections, strict guest hour enforcement, and even a wild proposal to install motion cameras on every corner for security. All funded by a new community fee she said would be mandatory but flexible, whatever that meant. And when she realized no one was buying it, she tried shifting tactics, pretending to be reformed, walking dogs she clearly borrowed just for photo ops, smiling like a crocodile at anyone who passed, and even showing up at my garage to offer an awkward, completely insincere olive branch in the form of homemade cookies, which I knew better than to eat, because let's face it, if Karen could poison credibility, a batch of snickerdoodles wasn't out of the question. But while she was playing PR games, I was gathering the final piece of insurance, a full, itemized timeline of every incident involving Karen over the past year, compiled from emails, forum, posts, security footage, and resident statements, all documented neatly in a binder I dubbed the Karen Chronicles. And on the night of the committee election, I didn't have to speak a word. Michelle gave a short, honest speech. Karen ranted about restoring order, and then I simply handed the binder to the moderator in front of everyone and said, "You may want to make this available for context," which led to a spontaneous, popcorn-munching moment as the community flipped through the documented saga of her tantrums, lies, and destruction, all while Karen stood frozen, as if she couldn't believe the mirror being held up to her face. And when the votes came in, Michelle won by a landslide, with Karen getting only one vote, likely her own. And for the first time in all the years I'd lived here, I saw Karen speechless, her mouth working but no sound coming out, her shoulders slumping like a puppet with its strings cut. And she left without a word, her campaign flyers left to rot on lampposts, her threats now just hollow echoes. But even then, I wasn't quite ready to let down my guard, because Karen had proven she never surrendered gracefully, and sure enough, just 2 weeks later she tried one last move, submitting a complaint to the state about improper governance procedures, falsely claiming that our election was invalid due to procedural flaws, a claim that triggered an audit process, not because it had merit, but because the state takes all complaints seriously, and while that should have been stressful, I welcomed it. Because I knew we had done everything by the book, and when the official from the Office of Civic Neighborhoods arrived, clipboard in hand, it took him less than an hour to confirm that our procedures were flawless. Our leadership, rotation model was exemplary, and our gate system, yes, that gate was considered a model example of community-led infrastructure security, even asking for permission to reference our neighborhood in a best practices report, which I proudly agreed to, knowing full well that Karen would have to read it one day, and when the final ruling came down clearing us of any wrongdoing, it came with an unexpected bonus. A formal citation issued to Karen for filing a false and malicious complaint, her second documented infraction with the city in under 6 months, meaning that if she tried anything again, she'd be flagged for habitual nuisance behavior and subject to fines or possible restraining orders depending on the severity, and that, my friend, was the moment it all turned, the moment the rest of the neighborhood truly, finally understood what I had been quietly building for months. Not revenge, not control, but protection, a secure, resilient system of governance, trust, and actual community. And as for Karen, well, she began to fade into the background like a shadow shrinking at noon, her outbursts fewer, her walks faster, her glares still venomous but impotent. Because when people stop listening to the loudest voice and start following the wisest one, the narcissists of the world lose their favorite weapon, attention, and though I could tell she was still stewing, Still fantasizing about some dramatic comeback, I knew the locks had clicked into place for good this time, and the doors she once kicked open with entitlement now stood sealed. Not by force, not by vengeance, but by the will of a united community that had finally learned its lesson. Never give the keys to someone who only knows how to slam doors. It began with silence, the kind that feels too calm, too still, like the breathless pause before a thunderclap. And after Karen's failed power grab, her failed complaint to the state, and her slow, steady descent into social isolation, the neighborhood had exhaled as one, assuming she had finally burned out like a bulb too stubborn to replace. But I knew better, because tyrants don't vanish quietly, they recalculate, and true to form, Karen's final move wasn't loud or public, but venomously quiet and anonymous. Tip called into the city alleging that my business, yes, my private locksmithing operation, was being illegally operated out of my residential garage in violation of zoning laws, a claim that would have triggered a steep fine and possible license suspension if it were true, which of course it wasn't, because I'd been running my business legally for 12 years with proper licenses, separate P.O. boxes, and my actual installation work conducted off-site, with the garage used purely for design, blueprint storage, and occasional repairs. But the moment that investigator knocked on my door with a routine inquiry, I saw through it instantly. And while the city official left satisfied after a brief walkthrough and a copy of my documents, I was done. Playing defense, because this wasn't just Karen being annoying, it was Karen actively trying to destroy my livelihood, and that made it personal, not just for me, but for everyone else who now relied on me for the neighborhood's security, both physical and emotional, and so I decided to deliver a kind of justice Karen couldn't wriggle away from. Not vengeance, but exposure, the kind that doesn't rely on anger but on truth, and for that, I needed help. So I reached out to a friend of mine, Tessa, a former investigative journalist turned documentarian who had been building a series on suburban power abuse and was immediately intrigued when I told her, "I've got a woman who once tried to tow off her own gate." And over the next few weeks, Tessa filmed interviews, gathered footage, and built a portrait not just of Karen the person, but Karen the archetype, the self-appointed queen of a cul-de-sac who weaponized bylaws, exploited apathy, and screamed order while sowing chaos. And to ensure everything was legal, we pixelated her face, changed her name in the final, cut but left every quote and incident intact, documented, verifiable, and backed by timestamps. And when it went live online under the title, "Tyrants in Tupperware Towns, the Hidden Reign of Suburbia's Worst Rulemakers," it exploded far beyond our sleepy community, racking up millions of views, getting shared by news outlets, and, yes, inevitably being recognized by people who knew Karen personally despite the edits, and suddenly her entire past, her antics, her rage, her entitlement, was the internet's favorite cautionary tale, with memes, parody accounts, and even a remix video set to the song "Locked Out of Heaven" using footage of her screaming at the gate. Yet even that wasn't the real finish. No, the final strike came not from me, not from the video, not even from the city, but from Karen herself, because apparently the exposure triggered something deep and fragile in her foundation. Something cracked and leaking just beneath the surface, because after the documentary dropped, she tried to take revenge one last time by suing me for defamation, emotional distress, and damages, which would have been laughable if it weren't so pathologically absurd, except this time she didn't realize what she'd walked into because my attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Camilla who'd worked civil cases for 2 decades, responded with a countersuit so sharp it could slice drywall, citing malicious intent, harassment, attempted sabotage of my business, false complaints to city officials, and an ongoing pattern of targeted disruption. And this time, we weren't just defending, we were going on offense, and in court, where emotions don't matter. But evidence does. Karen fell apart in real time, stammering, deflecting, contradicting herself under cross-examination, especially when confronted with community forum logs, video exhibits, and her own signed complaint forms, which proved malicious falsity beyond any reasonable doubt. And after 3 long days of proceedings, the judge not only threw out her suit with prejudice, but awarded me a sizable financial judgment for damages, which her homeowner's insurance partially covered, but not enough to prevent the cherry on top. A lien filed against her property to fulfill the remainder, forcing her to either pay up or sell, and within 2 months, the for sale sign appeared on her lawn like a white flag flapping in defeat, and Karen vanished from our lives, not with a scream or a speech, but with a moving truck and the dull thud of cardboard boxes marking the end of her reign. And as the truck pulled away, a small group of us stood by the gate she once hated, now freshly painted and humming with smooth automation, and we clapped, not out of cruelty but catharsis, because we'd survived, we'd endured, and we'd rebuilt something stronger than a gate or a bylaw. We'd rebuilt our community, and in the weeks that followed, peace returned like a long-lost guest. Kids played without being scolded, neighbors waved without suspicion, and I went back to doing what I loved, designing locks that kept the right people in and the wrong people out. And occasionally, when someone new moved in and asked why the keypad had a Karen override function, I'd just smile and say, "That's a long story," knowing that behind every bolt and every code was the lesson that no matter how loud someone screams, no matter how many flyers they stuff in your mailbox or meetings they hijack, the truth, documented, witnessed, and finally heard, clicks shut like a deadbolt. And justice, like a well-cut key, always finds the right fit. If you enjoyed my revenge story against the HOA, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll keep bringing you more explosive tales like this, so stay connected to the channel for more stories.